The glass doors of the private Manhattan fertility clinic slid open with a soft mechanical sigh, as morning sunlight cut through the lobby like a blade of white fire reflecting off polished marble floors and chrome accents, and in that frozen instant of light and silence Ethan Carter stood perfectly, still holding a sealed medical folder, as if it weighed nothing, yet carried the authority of an entire ending, while across from him Maya Johnson sat in a waiting chair with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture calm, but her eyes carrying the quiet exhaustion of someone who had already survived too many conversations like this one, and the doctor's voice had not yet fully faded from the room. When Ethan finally spoke in a tone so controlled, it almost sounded rehearsed, "You are infertile, Maya." The words landed without anger, without hesitation, without warmth, just a conclusion delivered like a business report, and for a moment the entire world seemed to narrow down to the distance between them, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above the faint rustle of paper in the doctor's hand, and the distant sound of New York traffic outside the window. Maya did not respond immediately. She simply blinked once slowly, as if measuring whether what she had just heard belonged to reality or to some cruel misunderstanding. Then she looked down at her hands instead of at him, as if anchoring herself to something physical before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice was steady but quiet. "What did you just say?" Ethan did not move closer. He did not soften his expression. He only adjusted his cufflinks, as if preparing to leave a meeting he had already decided was over. "I said this isn't going to work, not for us, not for me. I need a future that moves forward, Maya, not one that stays stuck in uncertainty." And as he said it, he finally looked at her, not with rage, not with heartbreak, but with the detached clarity of a man who believed he was making a rational decision. Maya's breath slowed, her fingers curled slightly into her palm, but she did not break. She had learned long before this moment that survival sometimes meant refusing to give pain the satisfaction of reaction. Outside the glass walls of the clinic, a yellow cab pulled past, spraying faint mist across the sidewalk, and inside, Ethan Carter, a man known across New York financial circles as one of the youngest CEOs to build a billion-dollar logistics empire, slid the folder shut with precise finality, as if closing a chapter that required no further discussion. Maya rose slowly from her chair, her movements controlled, deliberate, almost graceful despite the weight pressing against her chest. And when she finally spoke again, her words were not a plea nor a protest. They were simply truth. "You made your decision before you walked into this room, didn't you?" Ethan paused just long enough for silence to answer for him. Then he turned slightly toward the door, as if the conversation had already expired, and said quietly, "I made a decision based on facts, and I can't build a life on something uncertain." And with that sentence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Maya watched him for a moment longer, the man she had once believed she might build a future with, standing under the sterile glow of clinic lights, already halfway gone in his mind. And she realized in a way that surprised even her that she was not going to argue, because there are moments when fighting for someone becomes indistinguishable from losing yourself. So she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and picked up her bag from the chair beside her, and as she walked past him toward the exit, her shoulder brushed faintly against his suit jacket, but neither of them turned back, and the glass doors opened again, letting in the cold air of early morning Manhattan, wrapping around her like a silent verdict as she stepped outside onto the sidewalk, where the city was already moving too fast to care about a single breaking heart. While behind her, Ethan remained still for just a fraction longer than necessary, watching her figure disappear into the stream of pedestrians, as if something inside him had briefly hesitated. But he did not call her name. He did not ask her to stop. He simply exhaled and looked away, convincing himself that what he had done was necessary, because men like Ethan Carter did not mistake control for certainty. And as he walked toward his waiting black car parked at the curb, his phone buzzed with notifications from board members and scheduled calls and meetings that demanded his attention, pulling him back into the architecture of his perfect life. But even as he opened the car door, there was a faint unease he could not name, something small, something unresolved, like the echo of a sentence that had not fully ended. Yet miles away, Maya stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching traffic blur past her as the wind tugged gently at her coat, and she placed one hand instinctively over her lower abdomen, though there was nothing visible, nothing confirmed, only a quiet uncertainty she had not yet allowed herself to examine too deeply. And as she stood there in the noise of the city, she made a decision, without words, without ceremony, without witnesses that whatever came next would not belong to anyone else's judgment anymore. And behind her the clinic doors closed softly, erasing the last shared space between them as New York continued to breathe and move forward, unaware that something had just begun in the silence between two people who had mistaken an ending for the final word. While in another part of the city, Ethan Carter's driver merged into traffic, and the skyline reflected across the tinted glass like a promise of control that had not yet been tested the morning after the clinic. Manhattan did not slow down for anyone, and certainly not for a man like Ethan Carter, whose name appeared daily in financial briefings and business headlines as he sat inside the back seat of a black executive sedan, moving through midtown traffic with the calm precision of someone who believed every variable in life could eventually be calculated and controlled. Yet for the first time in years there was a slight disruption in that internal certainty, something small and unregistered like a faint imbalance in an otherwise perfect equation, as his driver spoke briefly about the morning schedule while the city slid past in blurred glass reflections, and Ethan stared at his tablet without fully absorbing the numbers on the screen, because his mind kept returning to a single moment in the clinic where Maya Johnson had not argued or pleaded or collapsed into the emotional patterns he might have expected, but instead had simply accepted his words with a silence that felt heavier than any protest. And that silence now lingered in ways he could not fully articulate, as if it had attached itself to the edges of his thoughts, refusing to dissolve into logic or distraction. And when he arrived at the Carter Industries headquarters, a towering glass structure overlooking the Hudson River, the world immediately resumed its familiar rhythm of meetings and contracts and strategic discussions and assistants moving through hallways with urgent efficiency. Yet even in the glass conference room, where projections of global logistics expansion filled the air with charts and forecasts, Ethan found himself pausing slightly longer than usual between decisions, as if recalibrating something internal that no one else could see. While across the city, Maya Johnson stood in a small apartment in Brooklyn, where morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting soft lines across a modest kitchen table where a single unopened envelope sat beside a glass of water and a half-eaten piece of toast that she had not finished because her appetite had not fully returned since the clinic, and she had not told anyone, yet not family, not friends, not even herself, in a complete sentence what had happened, because the truth still felt like something unfinished, something suspended between possibility and denial. And when she finally lifted the envelope, again her name printed neatly on the front in clinical handwriting, she hesitated for a long moment before opening it, and inside were standard medical documents and follow-up notes written in careful neutral language. But one line stood out sharper than the rest, not as certainty, but as probability, and she closed her eyes briefly as her hand moved instinctively to her lower abdomen, again not in fear, but in a kind of quiet awareness that something had begun without permission or announcement. And later that same day, Ethan Carter attended a board meeting where investors discussed projected earnings for the next quarter and expansion into new international shipping routes, and he spoke with his usual clarity and control, guiding the conversation with practiced authority. Yet halfway through a presentation, he paused unexpectedly when a simple phrase from a subordinate about long-term legacy planning echoed in his mind in a way that felt strangely misaligned with his usual priorities, because legacy had always been abstract to him, something tied to companies and acquisitions and structural impact on markets, not personal consequence. And after the meeting ended, he remained in the conference room longer than necessary, watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass, as if trying to locate the source of a thought he could not fully dismiss, while Maya spent her afternoon walking slowly through a neighborhood park in Brooklyn, observing families and children playing near benches and pathways where sunlight reflected off scattered leaves. And she stopped once near a small playground where a child laughed loudly while running toward a parent, and she found herself standing still longer than intended, not because she envied anything specific, but because she was suddenly aware of how irreversible certain paths become once they begin to unfold. And she pressed her hand gently against the strap of her bag as she continued walking until her phone rang with an unknown number, which she almost ignored until something instinctive made her answer, and on the other end was a calm professional voice requesting confirmation of a follow-up appointment from the clinic, and she listened carefully without interrupting. before simply saying yes in a steady tone that surprised even her. And when the call ended, she stood for a moment beneath the open sky of the park, feeling the weight of ordinary sounds around her, children calling out in the distance, birds shifting in the trees, footsteps on gravel, and she realized that nothing in the world had changed visibly, yet everything within her had already begun to reorganize itself in silence. While across the river, Ethan Carter's evening schedule included a private dinner with international investors in a high-rise restaurant overlooking the skyline. But as he sat at the table surrounded by conversation and glassware and carefully structured discussions about global markets, he found himself momentarily distracted by the reflection of city lights in the window, because for an instant it reminded him of the clinic floor that morning and the way Maya had looked at him without breaking, and by the time he returned home that night to his penthouse overlooking Central Park, he remained standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows longer than usual, as if waiting for a thought to resolve itself into clarity, but it did not. And somewhere in Brooklyn, Maya turned off the lights in her apartment and sat quietly in the dark with both hands resting still as she listened to the distant sounds of the city continuing without pause or acknowledgement, as if the world had no awareness of the quiet turning points occurring within it. And in that same silence, two lives that had once diverged began moving forward on separate paths that would inevitably collide again, though neither of them yet understood the shape that collision would take. The city had a way of making time feel both immediate and distant at the same time, as if every moment was happening too fast to fully process, yet too slow to ever truly escape. And in the days following the quiet shift that neither Ethan Carter nor Maya Johnson could fully name, the world around them continued its relentless rhythm of meetings and appointments and scheduled calls and city noise that never paused for private uncertainty, and Ethan found himself increasingly anchored in work, not because he needed distraction, but because structure had always been his way of restoring control when something internal began to drift outside of its expected boundaries. So he moved through his mornings at Carter Industries headquarters with the same precision as always, reviewing global logistics projections, signing off on multi-million-dollar agreements, and speaking with executives across time zones. Yet there were moments, now small and uninvited, where his focus would fracture for reasons he could not fully identify, such as during a quarterly review when a presentation slide briefly mentioned long-term continuity planning and the phrase lingered in his mind longer than it should have, or when he passed a conference room glass wall and caught a reflection of himself standing alone for half a second longer than necessary before continuing forward. While across Brooklyn, Maya Johnson began to experience time differently, not in the structured blocks of corporate schedules, but in quiet increments defined by waiting and uncertainty. And she returned to the clinic for a follow-up appointment on a gray morning when the sky seemed pressed low against the buildings and the waiting room was filled with the soft hum of television noise and distant conversations that never fully resolved into anything meaningful. And when her name was finally called, she walked through the corridor with steady steps that did not reveal the tension held beneath her calm exterior, and the physician greeted her with professional familiarity before guiding her through a series of standard evaluations and questions. And there was nothing dramatic in the process, no sudden revelations, only incremental confirmations delivered in careful, neutral language that attempted to maintain objectivity while still acknowledging something deeply personal. And when the words were finally spoken, confirming what had only been a possibility before, Maya did not react immediately. She simply listened, as if hearing a translation of something her body already understood before her mind had fully accepted it. And when the appointment ended, she stepped outside into the cool air of the street and stood for a moment beneath the muted light of the morning, feeling the city move around her without interruption, as if nothing in the external world had changed at all, despite the fact that everything within her now carried a different weight. And she placed one hand slowly against her lower abdomen, not as a gesture of shock, but as a quiet acknowledgement of reality settling into place, without permission or preparation. And later that day, she sat in her small Brooklyn apartment, holding the printed report in her hands, again reading the same clinical phrasing multiple times. Not because it changed, but because repetition sometimes helps the mind catch up to truth. And she thought briefly about Ethan Carter, not with anger or sadness, but with a distant clarity that felt almost detached. as if recalling a version of life that belonged to someone else, and she wondered what he would say if he knew, and then just as quickly dismissed the question, because she already understood that the answer would not matter in the way it once might have. While across the river, Ethan attended a private strategy briefing where international expansion plans were being discussed in detail across a long polished table surrounded by executives and financial analysts, and the conversation moved fluidly through projected revenue models and logistical frameworks, but Ethan found himself briefly distracted when his assistant placed a folder in front of him containing routine administrative updates, and one line referencing scheduling availability caught his attention for reasons he could not explain, and he paused for a fraction longer than expected before continuing the discussion with professional composure, yet internally. Something subtle had begun to shift, not as emotion, but as awareness, like a faint awareness of continuity that extended beyond boardrooms and acquisitions and market forecasts into areas he had not previously assigned significance. And later that evening, he returned to his penthouse overlooking Central Park, where the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly into the distance like a grid of controlled motion, and he stood by the window with a glass of water untouched in his hand as he reviewed messages on his phone and emails that required immediate responses. Yet his focus drifted again without invitation toward a memory he had not consciously revisited of Maya standing in the clinic with her quiet, steady expression in the way she had not asked him to stay or argue or reconsider, and he found himself pausing at that realization longer than he expected, because he had interpreted her silence at the time as acceptance of logic, but now it felt different, not passive, but deliberate. And across Brooklyn, Maya prepared dinner slowly in her kitchen, not because she was particularly hungry, but because routine helped stabilize thought, and she moved with careful attention to small tasks like chopping vegetables and heating water and setting the table, even though she was alone. And as she worked, she occasionally paused without fully realizing it, her hand resting briefly on the counter, as if grounding herself before continuing, and the evening light shifted gradually through her apartment, casting long, soft shadows across the floor, and she sat down eventually at the table, without turning on music or television, and simply listened to the quiet sounds of the building settling and distant traffic below, and she thought about what came next, not in dramatic terms, but in practical steps, medical follow-ups, personal decisions, timing, communication, and she realized that the path ahead was no longer theoretical, it was already in motion. And somewhere across the city, Ethan closed his laptop earlier than usual that night, and remained seated in silence for several minutes before turning off the lights and standing by the window again, watching the skyline, as if searching for clarity in distance that refused to provide it. And for the first time since the clinic, he did not immediately return to distraction, but instead allowed the uncertainty to remain present without resolution as the city continued beneath him. And somewhere in that same city, Maya also stood by her window, looking out at the same lights from a different direction, both of them unaware of how closely their separate silences were beginning to align into something that neither control nor distance would be able to fully prevent from intersecting again. The days following the quiet alignment of their separate silences unfolded across Manhattan like a slow turning page that neither Ethan Carter nor Maya Johnson had fully agreed to read, yet the city continued to insist on its rhythm, as if nothing beneath its surface had shifted. While Ethan moved through the upper floors of Carter Industries headquarters, where glass walls reflected endless streams of data and projections that mapped global expansion with mathematical precision, and he remained the center of that structure, as always, speaking in measured tones during executive briefings, approving international contracts and adjusting logistics strategies that influenced supply chains across continents. Yet there were moments, now subtle and uninvited, where his attention would drift for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, such as when a junior analyst mentioned long-term continuity frameworks, or when he signed a document confirming attendance for an upcoming corporate summit, and paused almost imperceptibly before adding his name, with deliberate control, as if the act carried more weight than it should. And across the East River, Maya Johnson was learning how to exist within a different kind of structure, one that was not built from glass and steel, but from time and quiet responsibility, as she attended her scheduled medical follow-up appointments with increasing familiarity, not because the situation had become easier, but because repetition had begun to form its own kind of stability. and each visit reinforced what was already becoming physically undeniable, yet still emotionally difficult to fully integrate into her identity. And afterward, she would return to her Brooklyn apartment, where mornings began with sunlight filtering through thin curtains and evenings ended with the distant sound of traffic and footsteps in the hallway, and she found herself developing small routines that helped anchor her thoughts, such as preparing tea at the same time each afternoon or sitting near the window for exactly 10 minutes before responding to any message on her phone. And it was during one of these afternoons that an envelope arrived at her apartment building addressed in formal, embossed lettering carrying the insignia of Carter Industries, and when she first saw it resting in her mailbox, she did not move immediately, but instead stood still for several seconds, as if her body needed time to confirm that what she was seeing belonged to the present and not to memory. And when she finally opened it, inside was an invitation printed on thick cream-colored paper requesting attendance at the annual Carter Industries Global Innovation Gala, an event known across financial and corporate circles as one of the most exclusive gatherings in New York, where executives, investors, and international partners converged under one roof to witness announcements that often shaped entire industries. And Maya read the invitation slowly more than once, her expression unchanged, but her breathing slightly more measured as she processed the implications, not in emotional terms, but in practical ones, because attending would mean stepping into a space where her presence would carry context she had not yet defined publicly, and where Ethan Carter would inevitably be present as the central figure of the evening. And she placed the invitation on her kitchen table and sat across from it for a long time without speaking as afternoon light shifted across the surface of the paper, and she considered not what she felt, but what choice would mean now in a life that no longer belonged to just one trajectory. While across the city, Ethan received confirmation of final preparations for the same event during a boardroom meeting where projections for the gala were displayed across a wide screen detailing guest lists, security protocols, and media coverage, and his assistant briefly mentioned that invitations had been extended to select individuals connected to prior corporate partnerships, and Ethan listened without interruption until a name was mentioned casually in passing, a name that did not require explanation, yet still caused a slight pause in his internal rhythm, though his expression remained unchanged, and the meeting continued seamlessly as discussions shifted toward keynote topics and global market announcements. Yet later that evening, as he stood alone in his office overlooking the illuminated skyline, he found himself holding the printed guest overview longer than necessary, as if scanning for something that logic had not instructed him to search for. And when he reached Maya Johnson's name printed in formal alignment among dozens of others, it did not provoke surprise, but instead created a quiet stillness that settled beneath thought rather than above it. And he remained standing there for several minutes, watching the city lights flicker in patterns that resembled constellations of movement and decision. And across Brooklyn, Maya placed the invitation back into its envelope and walked slowly to her window, where she looked out at the same city from a different distance, not physically, but experientially. And she thought about the last time she had seen Ethan Carter in person, standing beneath sterile clinic lighting, speaking words that had altered the trajectory of her life in a way neither of them had fully anticipated. And she placed one hand gently against her lower abdomen, not in fear, but in acknowledgement of continuity that no longer belonged solely to the past. And she made a decision that did not require announcement or justification, but simply clarity, because avoidance had already defined too much of what had come before, and now absence would no longer serve as protection. And so the evening of the gala arrived across Manhattan with its expected precision as black cars lined the entrance of the glass tower, where Carter Industries hosted its most significant annual event, and guests arrived in coordinated waves of influence and recognition, while inside the grand hall light cascaded across polished surfaces and conversations layered into a steady hum of ambition and expectation. And Ethan stood near the center of the room, greeting executives and international partners with practiced composure, his presence as always anchoring the atmosphere of the space. Yet beneath that exterior there remained a quiet awareness that had not fully settled into language. And when the announcer signaled the beginning of the evening program and attention shifted toward the stage, entranced, the doors at the far end of the hall opened and Maya Johnson stepped inside, moving with steady calm through the threshold where light and sound converged into a single shared focus, and for a brief moment the room adjusted around her presence, not because of spectacle, but because of contrast between silence and attention, between memory and immediate reality. And Ethan saw her, then across the space, not approaching, not retreating, simply present in a way that did not seek permission, and the recognition that followed did not arrive as shock, but as a gradual alignment of unfinished understanding, and Maya did not look away, nor did she accelerate her pace, because she was no longer entering a moment defined by uncertainty, but one defined by consequence. And as she continued forward through the shifting crowd, the noise of the room softened imperceptibly, as if the environment itself was recalibrating around something that had finally returned to visibility. And Ethan remained still for a fraction longer than expected, not because he did not know what was happening, but because for the first time the structure of control he had always relied on did not immediately provide a response, and the space between them closed not through movement alone, but through recognition that what had once been deferred was now present in full and unavoidable clarity. As the evening continued to unfold around them, unaware that the center of gravity within the room had already shifted in ways no announcement on stage would ever fully explain, the moment Maya Johnson crossed fully into the Grand Hall, the atmosphere of the Carter Industries Global Innovation Gala did not break or collapse, but subtly recalibrated, as if an invisible thread of attention had been pulled through the center of the room, and everything else adjusted around it. While conversations continued and glasses clinked and soft orchestral music played from hidden speakers, yet beneath all of it, there was a shift that only a few people seemed to register, and Ethan Carter stood near the center stage line of sight, still surrounded by executives and international partners whose voices continued to move around him, but his focus had narrowed to a single point that did not require explanation, because recognition had already happened before thought could fully form. And Maya moved forward at a steady pace through the crowd with no hesitation in her posture, no visible sign of urgency, only a calm continuity in her steps, as if she had already accepted every possible outcome long before entering. And people naturally adjusted around her, without fully understanding why, some pausing mid-conversation, others subtly turning their heads following her movement as she passed between clusters of industry leaders and media representatives. And Ethan excused himself from a conversation without explanation, something he rarely did, and began walking toward her through the space that suddenly felt larger and quieter than it had a moment before. And as they closed the distance between them, the noise of the gala did not stop, but it receded into something distant and indistinct, like a secondary reality. And when they were finally within speaking distance, neither of them immediately spoke, because language at that moment felt like something secondary to recognition. And Ethan studied her face with a controlled stillness that masked the internal recalibration occurring beneath years of structured certainty, while Maya met his gaze without lowering her eyes, without softening, without retreating, and for a few seconds that stretched longer than anyone around them would have noticed, the world seemed to hold its breath in a way that was imperceptible but absolute. And then Ethan spoke, first in a voice measured and calm, but carrying a weight that did not match the neutrality of his expression. Maya, and her name in his voice, did not sound like a question or a greeting, but like an acknowledgement of continuity that had been interrupted, and Maya responded simply with his name as well. Ethan Carter, and that exchange alone carried more meaning than anything either of them could have said in that moment, because it confirmed that neither of them was experiencing the encounter as surprise, but as inevitability arriving late. And Ethan gestured slightly toward a quieter section of the hall away from the main flow of guests, and Maya followed without resistance, not because she was yielding, but because she was choosing, and they moved together into a side corridor lined with soft lighting and glass panels overlooking the city skyline, where the sound of the gala became muted and distant. And when they stopped again, there was more space between them, yet the tension remained unchanged. And Ethan finally spoke again, asking in a controlled tone how she had been, and the question was simple, but the context beneath it was not. And Maya took a moment before answering, not because she lacked words, but because she was choosing which version of truth to offer in a space that no longer felt governed by past definitions. And she said she had been well, in a tone that did not invite interpretation. And Ethan nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the answer without assuming completeness. And then there was another silence, this one different from the first, not heavy with shock, but layered with awareness of everything unspoken between them, and the life that had continued separately beyond that clinic moment. And Ethan glanced briefly toward the main hall, where the event continued uninterrupted, and then back at her, and he asked a second question more carefully this time about whether she had received the invitation, and Maya confirmed that she had. And again, no elaboration followed because both of them understood that the invitation was not the true subject of the conversation, and the silence returned, but now it carried the weight of proximity rather than distance. And Ethan finally shifted his stance slightly, his hands loosely at his sides, and said that he had not expected her to come, and Maya replied that she did not make decisions based on expectation anymore, and the statement landed with quiet precision, not as accusation, but as fact, and Ethan absorbed it without interruption, and for the first time a faint trace of uncertainty entered his expression, not dramatic, not visible to anyone else, but present in the way his focus remained slightly longer than necessary on her face, as if trying to reconcile the version of her he remembered with the version standing in front of him now. And in that moment Maya adjusted her posture slightly, placing one hand lightly near her abdomen without drawing attention to it, not as a signal but as instinct, and Ethan noticed the movement but did not comment, and instead asked a third question more slowly, whether she was staying in the city, and Maya replied that she was for now, and that answer carried no invitation for interpretation either. And beyond the glass the skyline of Manhattan stretched outward in layered lights reflecting across the river in patterns that suggested order even in distance, and inside the corridor the space between them remained defined not by anger or reconciliation but by the absence of shared assumptions. And Ethan finally spoke again, saying that he had thought about the clinic, and the words were careful, not emotional, but honest in their restraint, and Maya listened without interrupting, and when he finished she nodded, once acknowledging the statement without expanding it into meaning, and then she said something simple, that she was not there to revisit the past, and Ethan accepted that without argument, because there was no structure within him prepared to challenge it. And as they stood there, the sounds of the gala occasionally filtered through laughter, distant applause, the clink of glasses, but none of it reached them fully, and Ethan realized in a way that surprised him that the external environment no longer had influence over the internal space of this conversation, and Maya seemed equally aware of that separation. And after a moment Ethan asked if she intended to remain involved in anything connected to Carter Industries, and Maya replied that she had not decided yet, and the neutrality of her tone made it clear that her decision would not be influenced by proximity or avoidance. And Ethan nodded again slowly, and then looked briefly toward the corridor leading back into the main hall where his life existed in its expected structure, and then back at her, and for the first time since they had spoken, he did not immediately follow with another question, because there was none that would not distort the reality of the moment, and Maya shifted slightly, indicating that she would be returning inside, and Ethan stepped aside, allowing space without obstruction, and as she moved past him the distance between them felt neither resolved nor broken, but suspended, and he watched her walk back toward the light and sound of the gala while he remained in the quieter corridor alone for several seconds longer than necessary before eventually turning back toward the event. And as he re-entered the hall, the structure of his world resumed its external coherence, but internally something had been repositioned without announcement, and across the room Maya rejoined the flow of guests with the same composed presence she had entered with, yet now every step carried the awareness that nothing about the path ahead would remain purely private anymore, and somewhere between the movement of people and the rhythm of conversation, both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson understood, without words, that what had just occurred was not closure nor continuation, but the beginning of a second phase that neither of them could yet define, but both of them could already feel taking shape beneath everything else. The morning after the gala did not arrive with clarity, but with a lingering sense of unfinished equilibrium, as if the city itself had not yet decided how to categorize what had happened between Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson inside that glass corridor above Manhattan. And Ethan woke before sunrise in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, where the first light of day spread across the skyline like a slow calculation of color and distance, and for several seconds he simply stood by the window, without moving, his attention fixed not on the city, but on the absence of internal resolution that had followed him home from the event, because what had occurred between them had not produced closure or conflict, but something more difficult to define, which was awareness. Without conclusion and across Brooklyn, Maya also rose early. Though her sleep had been fragmented and light not from distress, but from a heightened sensitivity to thought that had followed her since the gala, and she moved through her apartment with quiet intention, preparing water, heating the kettle, and sitting briefly at the same table where the invitation still rested unopened beside yesterday's cup, and she looked at it without touching it, as if its meaning had already shifted beyond its physical form. And when she finally placed it back into a drawer, she did so not as rejection but as containment, because she had already decided that visibility did not require participation. And later that morning, Ethan arrived at Carter Industries headquarters earlier than usual, bypassing small talk in the elevator and stepping directly into his office where his assistant had already arranged his schedule with precision. Yet even the familiar structure of meetings and reports felt slightly misaligned, as if the rhythm he had relied on for years no longer fully matched his internal tempo. And during a briefing on international logistics expansion, he found himself pausing briefly when a regional director mentioned projected long-term human capital continuity. And although the discussion continued seamlessly around him, Ethan remained still for a fraction longer than necessary before responding in a tone that was measured but slightly delayed. And afterward, he dismissed the meeting earlier than planned, something that rarely happened, and remained alone in his office overlooking the river, while the city moved below in its usual coordination of motion and ambition. And he reviewed documents without absorbing them fully, not because of distraction in the traditional sense, but because his attention was being pulled toward a single unresolved variable that had no entry in any of the reports in front of him. While across the river, Maya attended a scheduled appointment at a private medical office where the environment was neutral and structured, and the conversation remained clinical in tone. Yet every confirmation she received reinforced a reality that no longer existed in abstraction. And afterward, she walked through a quieter section of the city, where residential streets replaced commercial density, and she observed ordinary life unfolding without interruption, children being escorted to school, adults entering cafes, conversations beginning and ending without wait. And she found herself reflecting not on uncertainty, but on sequence, because what had begun was no longer theoretical and required no emotional amplification to remain significant. And later that afternoon, she received a follow-up message regarding optional consultation scheduling, and she read it twice before setting her phone down without immediate response, not because she was avoiding decision, but because she understood that timing now carried equal importance to choice. And across the city, Ethan stood in a conference room preparing for a financial review presentation where global projections were displayed across multiple screens, and he spoke with his usual clarity, adjusting figures and responding to questions with controlled precision. Yet at one point, when a colleague referenced partnership continuity models, he paused for a fraction of a second longer than expected before continuing, as if recalibrating a thought that did not belong in the context of corporate language. And afterward, as the meeting ended and executives filtered out into the corridor, Ethan remained behind longer than usual, looking at the empty projection screen where data had just been displayed. And for reasons he did not articulate, he thought again of Maya, not in fragments of memory, but in continuity, as if her presence had not ended with the gala, but had instead transitioned into a quieter form of relevance that no longer required proximity to remain active. And across Brooklyn, Maya prepared dinner slowly in her kitchen, not because she was particularly focused on the meal, but because repetition provided structure for thought, and she moved with deliberate calm, chopping ingredients and adjusting heat, while the city outside continued its layered movement of sound and light. And at one point, she paused with her hand resting lightly on the counter and looked toward the window where evening light was beginning to soften the edges of buildings. And she thought, not about what had already occurred, but about what remained undefined. And in that same hour, Ethan left the office earlier than expected and walked instead of driving for several blocks through Midtown, allowing himself to move without immediate destination, which was unusual for him, because his life was typically defined by forward planning and scheduled transitions. Yet now he found himself observing small details in the city that he would normally have filtered out, such as reflections in storefront glass or the rhythm of pedestrians crossing intersections, and he realized in a quiet internal acknowledgement that his awareness of time had shifted not in duration but in texture. And later, that night Maya stood again by her window after dinner looking out at Brooklyn as lights turned on across buildings in staggered sequence, and she placed one hand briefly on the frame of the window, not seeking comfort, but grounding presence, and somewhere across the river, Ethan stood in his own apartment, facing the skyline with the same distance between him and the glass, and both of them remained in their separate spaces for several minutes, without movement or speech or external interruption, while the city continued beneath them, unaware that two trajectories which had once separated cleanly were now moving in parallel tension that neither schedule nor structure could fully contain. And in that quiet synchronization, without communication, both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson understood at a level that did not require articulation that whatever had begun between them at the gala had already progressed beyond the boundaries of chance encounter and had entered a phase where absence itself was no longer neutral but meaningful. The morning after the quiet realization that neither distance nor silence had resolved anything between Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson arrived over Manhattan with a pale winter light that softened the edges of the skyline, as if the city itself was holding its breath. And Ethan stood at his office window longer than usual that morning, not because he had nowhere to go, but because for the first time in years his schedule felt secondary to a thought he could not dismiss, which was not urgency in the traditional sense, but persistence, a steady awareness that something unfinished had moved beyond abstraction into reality. And across Brooklyn, Maya also woke early, though her sleep had carried a different weight in recent nights, not unrest, but continuity, as if her body had begun to align itself with an understanding her mind was still organizing. And she moved through her apartment with deliberate calm, preparing water and sitting briefly at the table where nothing had changed physically, yet everything had changed in meaning. And she placed a hand on the folded medical folder once more before closing it and setting it aside, because repetition no longer changed outcome, only clarity. And later that morning, Ethan arrived at Carter Industries headquarters and bypassed the usual corridor greetings with a focus that surprised even his assistant, who followed at a careful distance holding scheduled documents. Yet Ethan paused at the entrance to his office and asked for all meetings to be delayed by 1 hour, which was not unusual for most executives, but was unusual for him. And when the door closed behind him, he did not immediately sit at his desk, but instead remained standing, as if waiting for an internal alignment that had not yet arrived. And across the river, Maya received a message confirming that her next consultation appointment had been moved forward due to availability, and she read it without expression before accepting the change, because timing no longer felt like something she controlled, but something she navigated. And by midday, both of them were once again moving through separate parts of the same city, Ethan within glass walls and structured conversations about international expansion, while Maya walked through quieter residential streets toward a medical office where nothing about the environment suggested drama, yet everything carried consequence. And when her appointment concluded, she sat for several minutes in the consultation room after the physician had left, not because she needed confirmation, but because she needed stillness to fully absorb what confirmation meant. And when she finally stepped outside, she did not immediately return home, but instead walked slowly through nearby streets, observing people moving through ordinary routines that now felt separated from her experience, not in isolation, but in perspective. And she placed one hand briefly against her abdomen again, not as fear, but as acknowledgement. And across the city, Ethan ended a meeting earlier than expected after a discussion regarding future investment cycles and long-term stability planning, where the phrase future generation continuity was mentioned in passing, and it remained in his mind longer than it should have, not because of its corporate meaning, but because of its unintended resonance. And he dismissed the meeting with calm efficiency and returned to his office, where he remained seated for a long time without opening any files or responding to emails. And instead, he opened a secure internal archive that contained prior administrative records and correspondence and navigated through it without clear intention until a specific set of medical-related documents appeared on screen, not initially flagged as significant but stored as part of standard onboarding corporate insurance procedures, and he scanned them with detached focus until a detail within the metadata field caused him to pause. longer than expected, and the name associated with the file was Maya Johnson, and for several seconds he did not move, not because of shock, but because of recalibration as his mind processed information that did not align with previous assumptions. And across Brooklyn, Maya returned home in the late afternoon and prepared a simple meal without turning on music or television, and she moved through the apartment with quiet consistency until her phone rang and the number displayed was unfamiliar yet local, and after a brief hesitation, she answered, and on the other end was a calm professional voice confirming a follow-up coordination request related to documentation submitted through Carter Industries' affiliated medical coverage, and she listened without interruption, her expression unchanged until the call ended, and then she stood still for several moments before placing the phone down, because something that had been abstract was now intersecting systems she had not actively engaged in. Later that evening, Ethan remained in his office long after others had left the building, and the city outside had shifted into night as lights formed patterns across the river, and he reviewed the same internal record again, this time with deliberate focus, and the confirmation that followed was not immediate in emotional response, but structural in impact, because it clarified what had remained partially unanchored since the clinic, and he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked toward the glass wall, where the reflection of the city skyline framed him in stillness, and for the first time, he did not immediately attempt to categorize what this meant within professional or rational frameworks, and instead he simply remained present within the information without resolution. And across Brooklyn, Maya stood by her window later that night, watching traffic move below in long continuous streams of light, and she considered the sequence of events not as isolated moments, but as progression, and she understood that silence could no longer serve as containment, and in the following morning Ethan requested a private meeting outside of corporate schedule through his assistant without specifying subject, and when the arrangement was confirmed, he left the office earlier than usual and traveled without entourage to a neutral location overlooking the river where the city appeared slower and less structured, and Maya arrived shortly after with the same measured calm she had carried since the beginning, yet now with a clarity that did not require internal negotiation, and when they saw each other again, there was no need for introduction or hesitation, because the distance between them had already been defined by everything that had occurred before, and Ethan spoke first in a controlled tone, acknowledging what he had confirmed, and Maya listened without interruption, and when he finished there was a long silence that did not feel empty, but full of alignment, and she responded not with emotion, but with clarity, confirming what had already become reality, and for a moment neither of them moved, because the conversation was no longer about discovery but about consequence and responsibility, and the sound of the river below carried through the open space between them, grounding the moment in something external and steady, and Ethan asked a final question, not about the past, but about what came next, and Maya looked at him for a long time before answering that some things could no longer be decided in isolation, and the implication of that statement settled between them without further explanation, and Ethan nodded once slowly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in acknowledgement, and the conversation did not escalate or dissolve, but instead transitioned into a quieter understanding that neither control nor avoidance would define what followed. And as they stood there overlooking the river, the city continued its movement around them, unaware that a threshold had been crossed, not through conflict or revelation alone, but through recognition that certain connections once revealed cannot return to absence. And in that stillness, both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson understood without further words that the path ahead would no longer be defined by separation, but by the necessity of confronting what had already begun. The days following the meeting by the river did not unfold with dramatic interruption, but with a slow and steady restructuring of reality, as if both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson had crossed an invisible threshold that no longer allowed them to return to the version of life they had been living before. And in Manhattan, Ethan resumed his corporate responsibilities with outward precision, attending board discussions and international strategy calls where numbers, projections, and expansion models continued to define the language of his world, yet internally there was now a secondary awareness, running parallel to every decision, a quiet, persistent recognition that no structure built purely on control could remain untouched by what he now understood, and he found himself revisiting the internal medical records more than once, not out of doubt, but out of confirmation, as if repetition could anchor meaning more securely into logic, and across Brooklyn Maya's days had taken on a different kind of rhythm, one defined less by external schedule and more by internal adaptation as she attended follow-up appointments with increasing regularity, and each visit added layers of clarity that no longer required emotional interpretation because the facts were becoming self-evident. And one morning in a quiet consultation room, with soft neutral lighting and the distant hum of city traffic filtered through glass, the physician confirmed what had been forming gradually across previous evaluations, and Maya sat very still as the information was explained in calm clinical language that did not attempt to dramatize, but also could not soften what it represented. And when the word twins was finally stated, she did not react immediately, not because she did not understand, but because understanding arrived faster than emotion, and for a long moment, she simply looked at the monitor where two steady rhythms were displayed side by side, synchronized yet distinct, and the room felt smaller not from pressure, but from the magnitude of quiet realization, and she placed one hand slowly over her abdomen. Not in shock, but in acknowledgement of complexity that had expanded beyond expectation, and when she left the clinic, she did not call anyone or change her direction immediately. She simply walked through the city streets with a measured pace, as if recalibrating her sense of scale between herself and everything that now depended on her. And across the river, Ethan received a brief, encrypted notification from Internal Medical Administration confirming updated details within the shared corporate insurance framework, and he opened the document without hesitation because by now avoidance was no longer part of his response pattern, and as he read the updated confirmation, his expression remained controlled, yet something inside that control shifted, not outwardly visible, but structurally significant, because the abstraction had now become specificity, and he leaned back in his chair for several seconds without movement before closing the document and turning his attention toward the skyline outside his office, where the city continued its uninterrupted motion, and for the first time, he did not immediately translate the information into strategic consequence or corporate impact, but instead allowed it to exist without conversion, and that change, though subtle, marked a deviation in a system that had always relied on immediate categorization. And later that same day, Ethan adjusted his schedule again, clearing a private block of time without explanation to his executive team, and left the building earlier than usual, walking through Midtown without escort or destination, allowing himself to move through public space without structured purpose. And the city around him appeared unchanged, yet his perception of it had shifted slightly, as if distance between objects and meaning had been subtly altered. And across Brooklyn, Maya returned home after her appointment and sat at her kitchen table for a long time with the report placed in front of her, now fully reviewed and understood, and the confirmation of twins had introduced not confusion, but amplification of responsibility that required no emotional exaggeration to remain significant. And she reviewed practical considerations with quiet focus, such as medical scheduling, support systems, housing stability, and financial independence, not because she feared the future, but because she recognized the necessity of structure within it. And later that afternoon, she received a message requesting coordination from a private administrative office associated with Carter Industries, and she read it once without immediate response, then placed her phone face down on the table and sat in silence. As afternoon light shifted slowly across the room and across the city, Ethan stood in a private conference space overlooking the river where meetings were typically held, but he had not called a meeting, and instead he remained alone, reviewing nothing on the screen in front of him, simply observing the movement of light across water, as if external motion could provide internal alignment. And for several minutes, he did not speak or move or engage with any task. And when his assistant entered briefly to deliver documents, Ethan did not immediately acknowledge them, and instead remained focused on a point beyond the glass, where reflections distorted into layered abstraction. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but deliberate, instructing that all external engagements for the following day be cleared without justification, and the assistant paused only briefly before complying and leaving the room. And across Brooklyn, Maya prepared a simple meal later that evening, moving through familiar motions with steady hands. And at one point, she paused again briefly, not from uncertainty, but from awareness of time passing in a way that now carried additional weight, and she looked toward the window where city lights were beginning to emerge across buildings in staggered sequence, and she placed one hand again lightly against her abdomen, not as reaction, but as presence, and across the river. Ethan remained in his office later than usual, long after the building had quieted and the city had transitioned into night, and he reviewed no documents, made no calls, and instead remained in still observation of the skyline until the boundaries between professional identity and personal awareness felt less separated than before. And in Brooklyn, Maya also stood by her window at the same hour, looking out at the same city from a different distance, where both silence and sound existed simultaneously, and neither of them spoke or acted across that shared span of time, yet both understood in their own separate ways that what had once been a series of disconnected events had now become continuity, and continuity no longer allows the comfort of detachment. And as the night deepened across Manhattan and Brooklyn, the city moved forward in its usual rhythm, unaware that beneath its surface two lives were no longer diverging, but slowly converging toward a shared consequence that would soon require visibility rather than interpretation. The morning of the private investor summit arrived in Manhattan under a sky that carried no dramatic distinction, yet felt heavier than usual to both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson, as if the city itself was preparing to witness something it did not yet fully understand. And Ethan stood in his office on the upper floors of Carter Industries headquarters, reviewing the final agenda for the day, where international partners, hedge fund representatives, and strategic stakeholders were scheduled to gather in a private venue overlooking the Hudson River, and everything on paper remained unchanged from any other high-level corporate engagement. Yet internally, Ethan felt a quiet persistence that had been growing since the confirmation he had reviewed days earlier, and it was no longer a thought that could be isolated or compartmentalized, because it had begun to integrate itself into every layer of his decision-making without permission. While across Brooklyn, Maya prepared for her own scheduled appointment that morning, moving through her apartment with steady, deliberate motions as she placed essential documents into a simple folder and adjusted her coat before stepping outside into the cold air, where the city was already in motion with its usual density of sound and movement. And she traveled without urgency through familiar streets toward the same medical facility that had become part of her recent routine, not because she sought answers, but because she was now working within established reality rather than uncertainty. And when she arrived, the environment remained unchanged with its neutral lighting and quiet administrative rhythm, yet the weight of what she now carried made the space feel different in perception alone, and she sat in the waiting area for several minutes, observing nothing in particular, while her thoughts remained structured around practical considerations rather than emotional reaction. And when her name was called, she followed the physician into a consultation room, where confirmation was again reviewed, not as new information, but as reinforcement of continuity, and she listened carefully to updated guidance regarding timing and monitoring, without interruption, before acknowledging everything with calm clarity, and leaving the office shortly after with her steps steady and measured as she re-entered the city, where life continued in parallel streams of unrelated urgency. And across the river, Ethan arrived at the private summit venue in a black vehicle that pulled into a secured entrance beneath a glass structure overlooking the Hudson, where security was minimal but precise, and the interior of the venue had been arranged with understated elegance designed to emphasize conversation rather than spectacle. Yet even in this controlled environment, Ethan's attention remained partially divided, not outwardly visible, but internally persistent, and he moved through initial greetings and introductions with his usual composure, exchanging brief acknowledgments with investors and executives, while mentally tracking the schedule that would carry him through the next several hours. But there was a subtle difference in his presence that those closest to him might have noticed, though no one directly commented on it, because it was not disruption, but recalibration. And at the same time, Maya exited the medical facility and stood briefly outside on the sidewalk as traffic moved steadily around her, and she checked her phone once, reviewing a message related to administrative coordination that had been forwarded earlier, and she read it without urgency before placing the device back into her bag and beginning to walk again, not toward a destination of significance, but toward continuity itself. And later that morning, Ethan entered the main conference hall, where the summit formally began, and presentations commenced with structured precision as economic forecasts and global logistics strategies were displayed across large screens accompanied by measured discussion from industry leaders, and Ethan contributed when required with controlled authority, yet during a transition between segments, he found his attention momentarily shifting not toward the data, but toward the concept of long-term alignment that had been mentioned indirectly during a discussion on organizational continuity, and the phrase itself carried a resonance that extended beyond its professional meaning, and he paused briefly before responding to a question from a panel moderator with carefully composed clarity before returning to silence as the discussion continued around him. And across the river, Maya had returned to her apartment, where she reviewed a set of personal notes she had begun organizing over the past days that contained practical considerations regarding scheduling support and future logistics. And she worked through them methodically, not as emotional processing, but as structural preparation, and at one point she stopped and looked toward the window where sunlight had begun to shift across neighboring buildings, casting long geometric patterns across interior surfaces, and she remained there for a moment without movement, as if observing the passage of time from a neutral distance. And in Manhattan, the summit continued into its second phase, where networking discussions and closed-door meetings began, and Ethan participated in one such meeting with senior stakeholders where long-term projections were reviewed and investment strategies debated, and although his responses remained precise and measured, there was a growing internal awareness that his attention could no longer remain fully isolated from the parallel reality that existed outside corporate structure. And when the meeting concluded earlier than scheduled, he did not immediately transition to the next agenda item, but instead remained seated for several minutes after others had left the room, observing the empty conference table as if reviewing not the discussion that had occurred, but the spaces between it. And across Brooklyn, Maya prepared a simple evening meal later that day, moving through familiar actions with calm consistency, and the city outside continued its layered rhythm of traffic lights and distant voices and building illumination, and she paused once during preparation, not from hesitation, but from awareness of time passing differently now in increments that carried consequence rather than routine, and she placed her hand briefly on the edge of the counter before continuing. And in Manhattan, Ethan left the summit venue earlier than expected, stepping out into the late afternoon air where the Hudson reflected the fading light of day. And he walked without immediate direction for several blocks, allowing the structured density of his schedule to dissolve temporarily into physical movement. And as he moved through the city, he observed ordinary details that previously would not have registered, such as the timing of pedestrian crossings or the reflections of buildings in glass storefronts, and he recognized in a quiet internal acknowledgement that perception itself had shifted subtly in recent days. And later that evening, both Ethan and Maya stood separately in their respective spaces, looking out at the same city, now transitioning into night, where lights emerged gradually across buildings in layered sequence, and neither of them spoke or acted beyond still observation, yet both understood in their own separate ways that the alignment of events was no longer coincidental or abstract, but structural and approaching inevitability. And the city continued beneath them, unaware that two parallel lives were moving toward a convergence that would soon require not reflection, but direct confrontation with the consequences of everything that had already been set in motion. The city of New York moved into its late afternoon rhythm with a steady consistency that gave no indication of the internal shift unfolding within the lives of Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson, as Ethan stood once again within the upper levels of Carter Industries headquarters, where glass walls reflected the fading daylight into geometric fragments across polished surfaces, and the building itself felt like a controlled ecosystem of power and precision. Yet even here in the center of structured authority, Ethan's focus was no longer entirely contained within corporate boundaries, because since the convergence of recent events, his awareness had developed a parallel layer that operated beneath executive decision-making, and today that awareness had grown sharper, not louder, but clearer, as if certain elements that had previously been abstract had now taken form within his perception. And across Brooklyn, Maya prepared for an evening appointment that had been scheduled earlier in the week through formal administrative coordination, and she moved through her apartment with steady, deliberate actions, selecting simple clothing and organizing essential documents into a neutral folder before pausing briefly at her kitchen table, where she stood still for several seconds without external movement, as if aligning her internal state with what the coming interaction might require, and then she left the apartment, stepping into the cool air of early evening where the city carried its usual density of sound and motion, yet felt different in her perception, not because of change in environment, but because of change in context, and she traveled across borough lines without urgency, arriving at a private consultation facility located within a quiet professional district of Manhattan, where the atmosphere was controlled and understated, and she checked in without conversation beyond necessity before sitting in the waiting area, where muted lighting and soft ambient silence created an environment designed for reflection without distraction. And across the river, Ethan remained in his office later than usual, reviewing internal documentation related to upcoming strategic initiatives, yet his attention repeatedly returned not to the data itself, but to a set of logistical references connected indirectly to earlier medical coordination records that had become part of a broader internal awareness he had not previously engaged with in this way. And he opened and closed several files, without fully committing to their content before pausing and simply sitting back in his chair, observing the city beyond the glass, where evening light was now transitioning into night, and the skyline of Manhattan appeared layered and continuous, like an interconnected system of motion and intent. And in that moment, he did not think in terms of corporate structure or investment cycles, but instead in terms of sequence, because everything he had reviewed in recent days no longer felt isolated, but part of a progression that was still unfolding. And across town, Maya was called into the consultation room, where she met with a physician whose tone remained professional and consistent as updated information was reviewed regarding timing and procedural monitoring, and she listened without interruption, absorbing the information with quiet focus while maintaining a steady presence that did not shift outwardly despite the increasing complexity of what was being confirmed. And when the discussion concluded, she remained seated for a brief moment after the physician left, allowing the silence of the room to settle before standing and collecting her belongings. And she did not immediately exit the building, but instead paused near the corridor window where she could see the city outside, now fully transitioning into evening illumination with traffic lights and building windows forming continuous patterns of movement. And she observed it for several seconds without reaction, not because she was detached, but because she was processing continuity rather than individual moments. And later that same evening, Ethan left his office earlier than expected, and instead of returning directly to his residence, he requested his driver to take a route along the river where the city skyline was visible in full span, and he remained silent throughout the drive, watching reflections of light across the water, while his thoughts maintained a controlled but persistent focus on the convergence of recent information that no longer existed as separate elements, but as a single unfolding structure. And when the vehicle eventually stopped near a quiet overlook point, he stepped out alone and stood for several minutes without movement, observing the river and the distant architecture as night fully settled over the city. And in Brooklyn, Maya returned home after her appointment and entered her apartment, where the familiar quiet now carried a different weight, not from tension, but from awareness. And she placed her folder on the table and sat across from it without opening it again, because its contents no longer represented uncertainty, but confirmation of a path already in motion. And she remained there for a long time in stillness, as the city outside continued its uninterrupted rhythm. And across the river, Ethan also stood alone in silence for several minutes before returning to his vehicle, and as he did so, he made a decision, without verbal articulation, that his schedule for the following day would be cleared of all external commitments. And this decision was not driven by urgency or emotion, but by recognition that the current trajectory required direct engagement rather than continued separation. And later that night, both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson remained in their respective spaces within the same city, now fully transitioned into night, where light patterns across Manhattan and Brooklyn formed a shared but distant horizon. And neither of them spoke nor initiated contact, yet both understood in their own separate ways that the alignment of events had moved beyond observation into imminent reality, and that what had been building across time and silence was now approaching a point where avoidance would no longer be structurally possible, because certain convergences once initiated do not pause for interpretation, but proceed toward resolution regardless of hesitation. And in that shared awareness, the city continued to move beneath them, unaware that two trajectories had reached the final stage before direct encounter, where silence itself had become the last remaining space before consequence. The following morning in Manhattan carried a different kind of stillness than previous days, not because the city had slowed, but because within the structured environment of Carter Industries headquarters, Ethan Carter had cleared his entire schedule without explanation for the first time in years, and this decision alone created subtle disruption across multiple administrative layers as assistants adjusted meetings, executives rescheduled calls, and international partners were notified of temporary unavailability, yet none of these operational adjustments mattered to Ethan in the way they normally would, because his focus had shifted entirely toward a single confirmed point in his awareness that no longer existed as abstract information, but as imminent reality, and he stood in his office overlooking Central Park with his hands resting lightly at his sides, not moving, not speaking, simply observing the city, as if recalibrating internal structure against external motion, while across Brooklyn Maya Johnson prepared for the same day with a quiet precision that reflected a similar internal alignment as she moved through her apartment, selecting simple clothing and placing essential documents into a neutral folder before pausing briefly at her window, where morning light filtered across neighboring buildings, and she stood there for several seconds without movement, not from hesitation, but from awareness that the next step she would take would no longer belong to routine, but to consequence, and she left her apartment shortly after, traveling through the city with measured calm until she arrived at a private corporate medical coordination facility located within a discreet Manhattan district where access was controlled and the environment designed to maintain neutrality, and she checked in without interaction beyond necessity before sitting in the waiting area, where silence was structured and deliberate, and during those minutes, she did not review documents or check her phone, but instead remained still with both hands resting lightly in her lap as she processed not uncertainty, but confirmation of what had already been established across prior evaluations and across the river. Ethan left his office earlier than any scheduled engagement and traveled without executive accompaniment through midtown traffic, observing the city through the tinted glass of his vehicle, as if seeing it through a different layer of perception where movement and structure existed independently of urgency. And when the vehicle arrived at a neutral riverfront location, he stepped out alone and stood for several moments without motion, looking across the water where reflections of buildings stretched into layered patterns of light, and he did not engage with any communication or system during that time because his focus was no longer on execution but on encounter. And across Manhattan, Maya was called into the consultation room, where the physician reviewed updated procedural details in a consistent professional tone, and she listened without interruption, maintaining steady presence while absorbing information that now functioned less as revelation and more as structural confirmation. And when the consultation concluded, she remained seated for a brief moment after the physician exited, allowing silence to settle fully before standing and moving toward the corridor, where she paused near a window overlooking the city, and she observed the skyline for several seconds, noting the continuity of movement below, where traffic flowed and pedestrians crossed intersections in uninterrupted rhythm. And she placed one hand lightly against the edge of the window frame, not for support, but for grounding, before continuing. And later, that same morning, Ethan re-entered his vehicle and instructed his driver to proceed toward a private executive facility located near the Hudson River, where Carter Industries maintained secure meeting infrastructure, and the drive was conducted without conversation as he remained focused on internal alignment rather than external schedule. And upon arrival, he bypassed the main entrance protocols and proceeded directly into a reserved conference space overlooking the river, where glass walls extended from floor to ceiling and the city was visible in full breadth beyond, and he stood there without sitting, without engaging systems or screens, simply observing until time itself felt less segmented and more continuous. And across Brooklyn, Maya returned briefly to her apartment after the consultation and placed the folder containing confirmed documentation onto her table, where she remained standing for a long moment before sitting across from it without opening it again, because its contents no longer required review, only acknowledgement, and she remained in that position as afternoon light shifted slowly through the apartment, marking time in gradual movement rather than discrete intervals. And across the river, Ethan remained in the conference space for an extended period without meetings or interruptions, and when his assistant attempted brief communication through secure channel, he responded only with a single instruction that all engagements remain suspended until further notice, and this instruction carried no emotional tone, but rather structural finality. And as the day progressed, both Ethan and Maya moved independently through their respective environments, neither initiating contact yet both maintaining an internal awareness that no longer fluctuated between uncertainty and recognition, but had stabilized into clarity that the coming encounter was no longer optional in timing, but inevitable in structure. And later that afternoon, Maya left her apartment again and traveled toward a predetermined location coordinated through administrative channels where the setting had been arranged for private discussion without external observation, and she arrived first, entering a quiet, neutral room overlooking the city where seating was minimal and lighting was soft and controlled, and she did not move immediately to sit, but instead remained standing near the window, observing the river below, where light reflected in steady motion. And across Manhattan, Ethan departed his building without escort and arrived shortly afterward at the same location, entering through a separate access corridor. And when he stepped into the room, he did not speak immediately, nor did Maya turn fully at first, and for a moment both remained within the same space without verbal exchange. Because the presence itself had already fulfilled what prior distance had delayed, and Ethan finally moved closer, stopping at a respectful distance, while Maya turned to face him with steady composure, and the silence between them was not empty, but fully informed by everything that had occurred across the preceding days. And Ethan spoke first in a controlled and quiet tone, acknowledging not only the present moment, but the confirmed reality that had brought them there, and Maya listened without interruption before responding with equal clarity, confirming what had already been established through prior medical and procedural channels. And for several seconds neither of them moved, because the exchange was not discovery, but alignment of known information into shared acknowledgement. And Ethan asked a final question, not about the past, but about structure moving forward, and Maya considered the question carefully before responding that whatever came next would require direct engagement rather than separation, and the implication of that statement settled between them, without need for further elaboration. And outside the glass, the city continued its uninterrupted rhythm, unaware that within a quiet room overlooking the river, two lives that had once diverged had now entered the same unavoidable space of consequence, where silence was no longer separation, but transition into the next irreversible phase of their shared reality. The private meeting room overlooking the Hudson River remained still in a way that felt almost disconnected from the rest of Manhattan, as if the glass walls had created a temporary boundary between consequence and the uninterrupted motion of the city outside. And Ethan Carter stood near the center of that space with his hands relaxed at his sides, while Maya Johnson remained near the window, not turning away, but not advancing either. And the silence between them now carried a different weight than before, because it was no longer the silence of recognition or confirmation, but the silence of consequence that required structure rather than interpretation. And Ethan spoke first in a measured tone that reflected years of controlling environments where outcomes depended on precision and timing, and he acknowledged what had already been confirmed in previous medical and administrative records, not as revelation, but as established fact. And Maya listened without interruption, her expression steady and composed, because nothing about the information being discussed required emotional amplification to remain significant. And when he finished speaking, there was a pause that extended longer than a simple conversational break, because both of them understood that what came next would define not the past, but the framework of everything moving forward. And Maya finally responded with clarity, stating that she had already begun organizing her own structure regarding scheduling, medical monitoring, and personal stability without reliance on external systems. And Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing not only her words, but the independence embedded within them, because it confirmed a dynamic that no longer fit within any previous assumptions he had made about control or involvement. And for a moment, he looked away toward the river beyond the glass, where light reflected in layered motion. And when he spoke again, his tone shifted slightly, not in authority, but in focus, as he addressed what responsibility would mean in practical terms. And Maya listened carefully before responding that responsibility would need to be defined through mutual clarity rather than unilateral direction. And the word mutual lingered in the space between them, because it introduced a framework that neither corporate structure nor personal history had previously prepared either of them to fully articulate, and Ethan stepped slightly closer, not closing distance entirely, but adjusting it into something more intentional, and he asked a question that was no longer abstract about how she envisioned stability moving forward, and Maya took a moment before answering, not because she lacked clarity, but because clarity itself now required precision and language that matched the weight of reality, and she explained that her priority was consistency and protection of continuity in a way that did not depend on external volatility. And Ethan acknowledged this without interruption because it aligned with his own understanding of structural necessity, yet there was still an underlying difference in how each of them interpreted control versus independence, and the conversation continued in measured progression as Ethan raised considerations regarding logistics, coordination, privacy safeguards, and long-term planning frameworks that could ensure stability without intrusion, and Maya responded to each point with calm evaluation, accepting certain structural elements while maintaining clear boundaries regarding autonomy and decision-making, and neither of them raised their voice or interrupted the other because the nature of the discussion was not emotional escalation but alignment of parallel reasoning systems attempting to converge on shared outcome. And at one point, Ethan mentioned legal and administrative protections that would need to be established to formalize responsibilities, and Maya agreed that documentation would be necessary, but emphasized that language used in any formal structure must reflect mutual respect rather than hierarchy, and that statement introduced a subtle recalibration in Ethan's internal perspective because it required him to consider frameworks beyond corporate precedent. And across the river, the city continued its uninterrupted rhythm, with boats moving slowly beneath bridges and vehicles tracing lines of light across avenues, while inside the room the conversation evolved into a quieter phase where both of them were no longer defining whether responsibility existed, but how it would be expressed in practical terms without distortion, and Ethan eventually returned to the subject of timing, asking how she was managing current medical scheduling, and Maya confirmed that she was following structured guidance with consistency, and that future appointments had already been planned within appropriate intervals, and there was no hesitation in her response, which further reinforced the stability she had established independently, and Ethan absorbed this without interruption, and for a brief moment the dynamic shifted, not in dominance or concession, but in recognition that both of them were operating from separate but equally deliberate frameworks, and Maya finally moved slightly away from the window, taking a seat at the edge of the table, not as submission, but as transition into a more grounded exchange, and Ethan mirrored the adjustment by remaining where he was, but lowering his gaze slightly, as if recalibrating focus from abstract overview to direct engagement, and the conversation entered a quieter phase where fewer words were exchanged, but each carried greater structural weight, and at one point Maya stated clearly that whatever relationship existed between them moving forward would need to prioritize the well-being of what was already confirmed as reality, and Ethan agreed without hesitation because disagreement was no longer relevant to the factual foundation they were both operating within, and yet beneath that agreement, there remained an unspoken complexity that neither of them had fully addressed, which was how identity and responsibility would coexist within this new structure without reverting to previous definitions of separation or control, and Ethan acknowledged this indirectly by stating that any future coordination would require consistent communication and transparency, while Maya responded that communication would be possible only within boundaries that preserved her independence, and Ethan accepted this condition without resistance because he understood that any attempt to impose structure unilaterally would destabilize what was already forming, and outside the glass the river continued its steady movement, reflecting the changing light of the afternoon as time progressed without pause, and eventually the conversation reached a point where no further immediate decisions were required, and instead what remained was acknowledgement of shared reality without final resolution, and Ethan looked toward Maya again, not with uncertainty, but with a more grounded awareness that the situation they were navigating no longer belonged to either of their previous lives separately, but existed as a convergence that would require continuous adjustment rather than a single decision point, and Maya met his gaze with equal steadiness, not yielding, but not resisting, and in that sustained moment of mutual recognition the space between them no longer represented distance or separation, but rather the beginning of a structured coexistence that neither of them had fully defined, yet both of them now understood could not be undone. And as the afternoon light shifted across the room, casting longer shadows along the polished surface of the table, and the city beyond continued its uninterrupted motion, both Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson remained in that shared space of emerging consequence where silence was no longer absence, but the foundation of everything that would follow, and neither of them spoke again immediately, because the understanding between them had already moved beyond conversation into the early formation of something that would require time, structure, and continuous recalibration to fully become what it was now destined to be. The riverfront meeting space in Manhattan remained quiet long after the conversation between Ethan Carter and Maya Johnson had reached its final phase of structural understanding as the afternoon light slowly transitioned toward evening, casting elongated reflections across the glass walls, and neither of them moved immediately because what had been established between them was no longer an exchange of information, but the formation of a framework that would define everything moving forward. And Ethan stood near the table with his posture steady, but no longer rigid in the way it had once been in corporate environments, because something fundamental in his internal architecture had shifted from control to structured awareness. And Maya remained seated with her hands resting lightly on the surface of the table, not in hesitation, but in grounded acceptance of a reality that no longer required interpretation. And after a long silence, Ethan finally spoke in a calm, measured tone, acknowledging that the arrangements they had discussed would require formal documentation and consistent coordination across both personal and administrative channels. And Maya responded without delay, confirming that she understood the necessity of structure, but reiterating that her role within any future arrangement would need to remain independent in decision-making while still allowing for aligned communication when required. And Ethan nodded slowly, accepting this condition without resistance, because he recognized that any attempt to impose hierarchy would destabilize what had already begun forming as a shared but balanced reality. And outside the glass, the Hudson River continued its steady movement, reflecting the fading light of day in shifting gradients of gray and gold, while inside the room, the conversation transitioned from definition to implementation as Ethan outlined considerations regarding timing of medical coordination, privacy safeguards, and logistical frameworks that would ensure stability without intrusion. And Maya listened carefully, responding only when necessary, with precise clarity that emphasized boundaries while maintaining cooperative structure. And neither of them interrupted the other, because the nature of the exchange had evolved beyond negotiation into alignment of parallel systems seeking sustainable equilibrium. And at one point, Ethan mentioned the importance of formalized legal clarity, not as control, but as protection of continuity, and Maya agreed that documentation would be necessary provided language reflected mutual respect rather than directional authority, and that distinction settled between them as an unspoken boundary that neither of them needed to challenge further, because it was already understood. And as the conversation continued, the tone softened slightly, not in emotional intensity, but in operational clarity, as both of them began refining the practical steps that would govern communication schedules, coordination of appointments, and future planning intervals. And Ethan adjusted his stance, slightly moving from the window toward the table while maintaining distance that respected the space Maya had defined. And Maya, in turn, remained composed, her presence steady and deliberate as she acknowledged each point with calm precision. And there was a moment where Ethan paused mid-thought, not from uncertainty, but from recognition that the structure they were building no longer resembled anything he had previously managed in corporate environments, because it required adaptation rather than control. And Maya observed this shift without comment, understanding it not as hesitation but as recalibration. And when he resumed speaking, it was with a slightly different cadence, more measured in consideration of mutual impact rather than directive outcome. And as the dialogue progressed, both of them reached a shared acknowledgement that future interaction would not be defined by singular decisions, but by continuous alignment requiring transparency, consistency, and respect for defined boundaries. And Maya emphasized again that independence would remain central to her stability, and Ethan agreed without qualification, because he understood that stability could not exist under conditions of imbalance. and the agreement that formed between them was not emotional resolution nor separation but structured coexistence. And as evening began to settle over Manhattan, the light outside the glass deepened into cooler tones, and the river reflected the first emergence of city illumination, while inside the room silence returned briefly, not as absence, but as completion of immediate necessity, and Ethan finally spoke in a lower tone, acknowledging that what they had established would require time to adjust, and Maya responded with a simple affirmation that time would be necessary for both of them. And there was no further elaboration because no additional explanation was required, and in that moment both of them understood that the foundation of their connection had shifted from uncertainty to defined reality, not resolved, but structured. And Ethan looked briefly toward the city beyond the glass, where lights began to appear across buildings in layered sequence, and Maya also turned her gaze outward, observing the same skyline from a different angle, yet within the same shared horizon, and neither of them spoke again, because what remained between them was no longer conversation, but continuity, and as they eventually prepared to leave the space separately, without urgency, there was no sense of conclusion, only transition into a new phase of interaction that would no longer be defined by distance or avoidance, but by deliberate and sustained engagement within boundaries they had both acknowledged and accepted. And when Maya stepped toward the exit, Ethan did not follow immediately, nor did she look back, because both of them now understood that the structure they had created required space to exist without distortion, and the door closed softly behind her, leaving Ethan alone for several moments within the glass room overlooking the river as night fully settled over Manhattan, and he remained still, not reflecting on what had been lost or gained, but on what had been formally established as reality. And across the city, Maya walked into the evening air with steady steps, carrying no uncertainty in direction, only awareness that the path ahead was now defined not by separation, but by structured coexistence, and the city continued around them in its uninterrupted rhythm, unaware that within one quiet room overlooking the Hudson, a transition had completed itself, not through resolution, but through alignment that would now govern everything that followed.